2, 1. We cannot do anything for the individuals that have previously been killed by things like the Crusade. We cannot do anything for the individuals that have been previously killed over things like arbitrarily constructed racial genocides. What we can do is do things for the individuals in the future that would be killed by things like this and many, many more. Opening government is going to make 3 arguments. The first argument we're going to make is to explain why humanity's existence is a net negative for humanity. The second thing that argument that we are going to make is to explain why, even if you don't believe that, humanity's existence for all other forms of life is a net negative that necessarily outweighs any clash on humanity itself. And I encourage you not to be what the majority of people are in the world, panel. Do not be self-centered. Think about things like animals. Think about things like the environment. Think about, for example, the way we torture animals for our own overconsumption of meat. The final thing I will then do is explain why humanity is likely to end anyway, and this is the best possible way to end it. So, on humanity's existence being a net negative, for itself, there are 4 parts to this argument. The first part of the argument is to explain that evolutionarily, most people are programmed when they live a net negative utility life, not to, for example, do things like be suicidal, which obviously means that people who do live net negative lives are often biologically forced to endure that. But the second thing that I'll note as part of this first mechanism is that every single person is programmed not to be content evolutionarily. And that is for the reason that often when you're content, you don't have the evolutionary drive to exist within competition and to push yourself. That means the limit and capacity for which humans are able to be happy is evolutionarily capped out because we're constantly comparing ourselves to our environment and other individuals in a way that prevents us from fully ever being happy. The second thing that I'll explain is that capitalism often exploits individuals, firstly, in the way that is very obvious in terms of, for example, you have to sell your labor in a way that creates unequal power dynamics, but also it is terrible for atomizing individuals in a way that, for example, makes people far more predisposed to things like mental health, in a way that makes them see the world through the eyes of consumerism. Thirdly, we're going to say that climate change is often irreversible. A tipping point has been reached, which means even if any opposition team can prove that we might totally switch to forms of existence that is completely renewable, they don't disprove this harm. But no, I think it would be very unlikely that they could prove that for the reason that people are short-termists and there are already huge amounts of corporate capture that exist. And because climate change is irreversible, that means that there are things like a scarcity of resources, which means that people necessarily will starve, but also it means that there are likely to be wars over those resources. It means that entire countries are likely to be submerged in water, and it's likely that the scarcity of resources compounds as a problem into the future because of things like population growth. The final part of this argument is just to explain that, more specifically, capitalism is built off oppressing people. That's because of things like the global value chain and the exploitation of labor that exists overseas. And what I would say is that necessarily means that there is always an underclass that disproportionately suffers relative to the rest of the world. And when I conclude this argument, I would like to note that the extent and the way that suffering is distributed is fundamentally principally just. You do not choose where or when you are born. You do not, for example, choose to be screwed over by the lottery of birth. And the majority of individuals, if not all individuals, are screwed over by this. The next argument I'll then make is to explain why humanity's existence destroys all other forms of life. The first part of this argument is to explain that capitalism often relies on destroying huge amount of land and ecosystems for things like production, for things like the creation of new factories, or for things like, the creation of fuel in a lot of instances. That means that we necessarily do things like pollution. But secondarily, it also necessarily means that that like the way that we do things like provide for ourselves in terms of meeting, like farming animals and things, is a way that is created to be optimized. And that is why you necessarily have things like animals not being killed humanely and not being killed proportional to what we need to survive, but simply being farmed day in and day out. Mother cows are forced to birth children and then watch them be slaughtered. So hormonally, they produce more milk. We say this way of treating other animals and ecosystems is abhorrent and compounds any amount of suffering that humanity could ever experience. Secondly, though, I'll reiterate what I say about climate change. to the extent that these effects are irreversible or often are about to reach a tipping point. And that means that obviously all of these other ecosystems are fucked over by this. And I'll explain obviously why later killing humanity means that, you don't often have those ecosystems destroyed. The third thing that before I do that though, I'll explain is that we're unlikely to ever create a relationship with other animals that gives them an equal amount of say or privilege for the reason that we care about ourselves more, both evolutionarily and it is a norm within society. That obviously just means that there are a huge subset of animals that continue to experience disproportionate amounts of suffering compared to the rest of humanity. And obviously, if you kill off humanity in this instance, and I'm about to explain why this is the best way to do it, the extent to which things like climate change wipes out species upon species is obviously slowed and in many instances prevented. Before I go on, I'll take closing opposition.
What is the underlying moral justification that your case depends upon to work for why things like human oppression are bad? You need to engage in the moral clash.
I think it's pretty morally bad to have on a utility level the amount of people continuing to suffer more. I second of all explain why they suffer arbitrarily. Thirdly, also I explain why you shouldn't care about animals in terms of suffering less than humans. So if we explain, for example, why there is net suffering in the world from the creation of humanity's existence, you ought morally oppose that existence. So why is humanity likely to end anyway? And why is this the best way to end them? Third argument in this speech. First of all, we think humanity is likely to end anyway for things like the amount of diseases that exist in the world and are currently multiplying. Not only things like COVID-19 exist, but see the way that the US has currently lobbied the World Health Organization to remove the patents that African pharmaceutical industries have to combat things like local diseases. We think this means that a huge amount of people, if not all humanity, are likely to inevitably die. Secondly, I explain why structurally there's likely to be a huge amount of wars and exploitation. And no, humanity has reached the point where we have the capacity to wipe each other out with things like nukes or the pressure of a button. But thirdly, see things like the Fermi Paradox, which suggests that the reason why we haven't encountered an alien civilization is because there is a barrier to most advanced civilizations being reached, one that humanity seems that it will face in the next 100 to 200 years. So why is this the best way to do it? Three simple reasons. One, this is obviously painless. That means that the amount of suffering that occurs is condensed to one specific moment and is not obviously as bad as, for example, being tortured. But second of all, we don't take the rest of the planet with us. And that means that we win on the moral clash that is engaged in with that POI. I encourage you to use your imagination. I encourage you to care about the world.
The Prime Minister for their fine speech. I'm super happy to welcome the leader of the opposition.
Hello, can I be heard?
You can be heard.
Okay, let me just turn on my camera. Great. I assume I can be seen because I can see myself. The speech content warning will contain mentions of suicide, torture, etc. All sorts of atrocious stuff. I feel it's important to clear that out before I start my speech. Okay. By the way, is there like any background noise on my end? Can people hear something, or are we good?
There's like, I guess so, but it's not distracting.
Oh, okay.
It's like
yeah,
it sounds like an AC or something like that.
Yeah, I figure the embarrassment of like scrambling for my like aircon remote is less worth it than just like the minor inconvenience of there being like a shh, I guess. Okay, starting my speech in 3. I'll take the US in chat. Starting my speech in 3, 2, and 1. You come across a button with the potential to instantly shoot a bullet into the forehead of everyone sleeping. You have attachments to these people. You believe in these people. You know they have hopes and dreams. This is murder and goes against every moral intuition you have. In this speech, we will advance 4 claims. 1, that this is murder and goes against, again, every moral intuition you have. 2, that you have attachments to your own life, and moreover, not pressing the button will drastically improve your quality of life moving forward. 3, humanity is likely to get structurally better and happier as time goes on. And 4, the animal rights case, that leaving humanity to die will effectively push climate change and a variety of other anthropogenic problems forward without any solution because animals do not have the tools to save themselves. First, and by the way, responses are integrated into the material. First, This is murder to you, which will go against every moral intuition you have. This is analogous to walking into the room of every person's house while they are sleeping and shooting to them. We have very, very strong aversions to killing people and the loss of life, the loss of experience, and the basic destruction of everything people have ever had for 5 structural reasons. Number 1 is revulsion. We feel a strong sense of empathy that is part biological and part evolutionary, where depriving people of their choice and happiness is anathema to us because we internally value our own happiness and because we empathize with other people that they may value their own happiness and choice as well. This is why we don't kill slaves, even if their life might suck. This is why we experience extreme revulsion if we shoot somebody that might be sleeping or going through extreme pain, because we should give them the decision to make that themselves and not assume it for them. Secondarily, socialization. This person has been historically taught about the wonders of humanity, human achievement, genius, overcoming the limitations of the human body, feeling like you are preventing the future progress. Basically, society socializes most people into believing humanity is an inherent good, and this is feel good, so it catches on quick. Hence, this narrative is structured like to be deeply embedded in your worldview. You are going against every social factor that has influenced you in your life. Thirdly, they have personal connections to many of the people they are disappearing, whom they care about. You want to see them flourish. You want to see them happy. You want to see them reach their full potential. Imagine you had a mom who will never get to see you grow old. You have a kid who will never get to finish college. A wife or a husband you will never get to grow old with. You have relationships with these people. You care about them and you are taking their lives away. Fourthly, obligations. You feel extreme and obliterating guilt, like you are betraying everyone that trusted you, everyone that raised you. And fifthly, afterlife. The fear of going to hell, that you were the one that murdered all these people. You will have to face penance for your actions. You will have to greet them, and you will have to answer for the reckoning of why you took away their lives. Why are these structural reasons the most important to you? Number 1, this is not just a motion about whether or not it's net morally good, but from the perspective of the info slide, you, an average person, are coming across a button and you are making the choice to end the world. Hence, there are 4 weighing meta reasons for why you should care about this more than their meta reasons. Number 1, this is the prevailing mindset as this is related to the irrelevant factors in your thought process. These structural reasons are themselves the meta weighing for why certain reasons are more important. Because even if theoretically you can consider other reasons like the future end of humanity, these are the top of mind fears for a decision as momentous as this. Secondarily though, principally, they assert that there is some negative utility, but the problem is that they are asserting this utility for people when everyone has their own utility calculus that you and only you can know. This means it makes no sense to kill everyone for the sake of some arbitrary utility, since we assign the utility value and you remove, obviously, the person's capacity to assign that utility value for themselves. You are effectively turning everyone into slaves and deciding for them that their life is not worth living, as opposed to letting them decide. Thirdly, this is most proximate to you, the people you grew up with, your likely outlook on life. These are all the predominant prime factors in your decision-making calculus, hence is more closely related to what you care about than humanity's net utility or whatever. And fourthly and finally, the sheer guilt and uncertainty in your head, the pain aversion that most people have to potentially taking everything away. This is akin to being on the ledge of a cliff, on the ledge of a roof, and threatening to jump off, but taking everyone else with you. This is just not something that most people will do. People do not have the moral resiliency or will to do this. This is just evil. I'll take a PY from CG before I move on.
These claims are all based off of moral intuitions. Can you justify why moral intuition best approximates moral truth?
No. These are moral intuitions the average person will have. You are making the decision from the perspective of an info slide. You're the third party here. Hence, you're making it from your lens, so these moral intuitions are truths to you. Secondarily, though, you also want to give your own life. Again, by construction, if you wanted to end your own life, you don't really need the button. Most people have strong intuitionist attachments to their pleasures and their hobbies. Moreover, when you do prevent from, don't use the button, you feel like you saved the world, you feel like you prevented mass-scale genocide of the human race, you can always carry yourself with a feeling of self-importance that you were, at one point, the most important person in the world, and you're likely to experience a strong sense of satisfaction and relief, appreciation for your life, even for the parts that aren't so good, akin to the relief that people feel after a last-second aversion of a suicide attempt or near-death experience. It puts your life into sharp clarity, and every good thing that happens to you is magnified intensely. Every bad thing that happened to you could always be rationalized away as something worse could have happened. Okay. Secondarily, third point, we also think humanity is likely to get structurally better and happier as time goes on. They sort of assert that humanity is net negative, that people are programmed to be never content, capitalism is exploitative and atomizes the people, and climate change is irreversible, and we have scarce resources. We have faced all these problems before. Global conditions are rapidly and persistently improving for 4 structural reasons. That 1, we are reaching a point of scientific innovation that has erased the burdens of most human struggle. We're allowing people to communicate across borders, solving most diseases that we could never have conceived of before. 2, increasing democratization and global trade, as well as increasing increasing education in most countries around the world gives nations mutual incentives to prosper and develop on a widespread scale. This is why capitalism is getting less and less exploitative, why there are increasing fetters about every nation in the world on the rapacious nature of capitalism and corporations. Thirdly, more and more educated societies are willing to criticize governments, provide crucial services necessary for the maintenance of life, etc., reducing the atomization and forming communities for people, as well as allowing them to communicate to people across the world, and form communities there. And we assumed that we would run out of natural resources several centuries ago. We were wrong every time because our technological capacity allows us to make the most of limited resources and do things like find new lands or find new resources we can use, go to different planets. This is all potential that you erase away with the assumption that you know better than every other person on Earth. Beyond that, they say humanity will die anyway. One, this is super speculative, and I'm not sure how this will play out in the calculus of person or the average person who will be pressing this button. But secondarily, there's just a lot of assumptions about, we might have a nuclear war. This is why persistently humanity is working towards defraying many of these worst harms and ensuring that we can come to solutions for most of these things. You basically take away the potential for humanity to come out for any of these solutions, due to like a 10% chance that humanity might die in the future. Even if humanity will suffer, we let them make the choice to suffer and die. Finally, the animal rights case. They say animals are farmed. One, this is way better than being hunted and brutally killed, exposed to food scarcity, being forcefully raped and killed to be mated in order for like the genetic thing to advance, right? These are all experiences that animals will have that they don't have in farms where they are fed, where they are kept safe, etc. And even in most reasonable states around the world will have animal rights welfare regulations anyway. But think of the dangers of all the stuff that's left behind: nuclear reactors, oil refineries, etc. Many of these problems are increasingly accelerating and we're anthropogenic in nature. Climate change is already happening. Global warming is already happening. Animals don't have the tools to stop this. They're going to go extinct anyway. It's only our side that has the tools to potentially reverse this in the future. They have condemned the world to death already. Them, taking the easy way out, taking the escape button is not going to solve things. At the end of this speech, it is clear. This is murder, horrible, and basically repulsive to everything you've ever known. This is taking away everything you've ever cared about in your own life, and this is worse for humanity writ large. For these reasons, oppose.
I thank the leader of the opposition for their fine speech, and I'm super happy to welcome the Deputy Prime Minister.
Hey, sorry, just give me like 30 seconds if that's all right. I have a lot of paper sitting around here. Sorry. Over here, I'm presuming at this point I could be heard. I presume someone would have told me while I was taking the time if I couldn't.
Yeah, you're audible.
Cheers. Sorry about that. There's a lot of paper. All right, I'm going to start my speech in 3, 2, 1. First, I'm going to respond to opening opposition, then I'm going to weigh our material. Let's start with the claims from opening opposition. First I'm going to start with the POI from closing opposition, which is to say, what is the moral framework? Well, the question is, in what way ought we construct a moral framework? We don't think we ought to, because morality isn't intrinsically true, it's constructed, right? And the question is, what is the best way to construct that moral framework? Clearly, the best way to construct a moral framework is to construct it in such a way that gets the most utility for society. Otherwise, that is a bad moral framework. Insofar as morality is not intrinsically good, it's purely instrumental. We should construct it in the way that gets the most instrumental utility. Therefore, it cannot be it cannot be moral in the world where applying that morality gets massive utility negativity. I would say if your moral system gets massive negative utility, then your moral system is bad and I shouldn't care about it. You can't say, oh, this isn't about morality. If we show this is awful for everyone, we clearly win. Now let's deal with opening opposition. They say this goes against a set of moral intuitions. Yeah, congratulations. This motion is a little bit counterintuitive, but you can't just point to those intuitions, in particular because the average reasonable person is willing to be convinced that sets of intuitions are wrong. You can't just say, oh, this is counterintuitive, therefore no one would ever do it. The next thing they say as well, you're going to feel a set of revulsion, so this will be a personal harm to you. First, you're not going to feel revulsion for very long. You're about to be erased. Second, you're not you're
even if you feel a short-term sense of revulsion, that is much better than the active pain and suffering for the rest of your life that you're going to experience that Ben proves to you. Finally, I would say, given the way that we are destroying humanity, the way that humanity is having an enormous amount of suffering, you have a moral responsibility to do this, and therefore you should do it even if you feel that sense of revulsion. The next thing they say is, well, you care about other people. Yes, you do. We explain that this is utility negative for other people, so we win on that. The next thing they say is, well, you wouldn't do this because you essentially the claim is like, oh, there's a handful of things that would stop people from being able to do this, therefore they wouldn't. But that is not how this debate works. This debate isn't a prediction about what an individual would do in this scenario. It is having a debate about what they should do. We are giving you the sets of arguments that explain why it is that they should do this. A person isn't always going to default to their moral intuitions. The next thing they say is, oh, you're going to go to hell. Obviously, the average reasonable person doesn't believe in a literal interpretation of hell in that way. The average reasonable person across the world is getting less religious. Even if they are religious, they don't believe in that super literal interpretation of hell. The next thing they say is, well, why do you have a right to be able to do this? Because you should allow other people to be able to make that set of decisions for themselves. First, to the extent that we show that you're causing massive external harms, for instance, to animals and other creatures, that is acceptable. You can take away someone's autonomy if them using their autonomy is also harming others, has sets of external harms. Additionally, in order for them to say, oh, it's bad that we take away people's autonomy, they need to prove that people are meaningfully exercising autonomy on their side of the house, right? We would say that people are not meaningfully exercising autonomy, right? Because people are artificially constrained by an evolutionary system that says to them, you have to continue existing. Noting, there's nothing like good about what evolution hard codes for. Evolution just hard codes for continued existence. That doesn't necessarily mean it hard codes for good things. I'll take opening opposition.
I mean, I could ask the same thing, right? Like, what is good about positive sensation, negative utility? These are things that we choose to value, and these are also similarly evolutionarily constrained. There's no reason to prioritize this over the other value.
Well, I think insofar as a person experiences utility in their average life, they experience good things and bad things. That is a thing that people should intrinsically care about, right? And also because all other sets of creatures experience it. The idea that, I don't think you're going to be able to rebut, utility is not important. Obviously, we have to make in some degree decisions about what is and what is not good. So in order for this autonomy point to stand, they have to prove that people are meaningfully exercising autonomy under their side. I explain that people are not, for the reason that evolution hard codes you with a desire to continue to exist even where that is utility negative, right? Not because that's good for you, but just because that's the thing that allowed for the culmination of your species. So therefore, the sets of species who had that genetic code were the ones who are likely to promulgate, not because it is in any way morally good. Secondly, I'd say, why is autonomy good? Because autonomy is not a prima facie good for individuals. Autonomy is good at the point where you can meaningfully exercise your preferences and therefore get preference fulfillment. We would say that in this instance, you are not fulfilling your preferences because you are making sets of bad decisions about continuing to exist. Finally, even if this was true, individuals also cannot consent to the other way in which humanity would end, which is things like sets of diseases and sets of war. So the problem with this argument is they don't prove they're consenting at all under their side. Even if they are consenting at the moment, they're not going to consent to the much worse ways, things like disease and nuclear war that are going to kill them. Okay, that's opening opposition's material. Let's weigh what Ben tells you. First, we explain to you that life is suffering for a handful of reasons. Things like the fact that evolution hard codes you to suffer in order to make you do things. Things like the fact that as society develops, we subjugate each other through processes of capitalism, that we're increasingly destroying the planet. What do they say? Their one claim is, well, life is getting better because we are getting better at doing stuff. First, this doesn't get around the fact that even when you achieve more stuff, humanity is still hard-coded to feel like they are unhappy because it drives us to do more things. Secondly, this development is disproportionately going to those at the top and in fact is increasing our ability to subjugate each other. It's increasing our ability to say, you have to work for me because I have more tools to subjugate you into making my life better. Finally, the problem is there is a set of finite resources and they say, oh, we're getting more efficient. Yeah, but no year ever has humanity used less natural resources. Obviously, even if we're getting more efficient, we're still using more resources and we're beginning to run out of oil. 19 years, a large part of the Gulf is going to run out of oil. That will be absolutely terrible. Weigh the size of this contribution. First, it deletes opposition and benches harm because they have to prove that humanity is good in order for it to be good. Secondly, for humanity, a big stakeholder in this debate, we clearly take it. Second claim, why this is terrible for all other sets of creatures. We explain that there's no reason to preference humans over other creatures, right? They experience joy and pain and emotion, and it's just the happenstance of the fact that we're the most powerful species that we construct it in that way. What do they say? They say animals are going to die more because they can't deal with climate change. First, obviously, we stop the bad impacts of climate change happening because it's caused by the humans. And secondly, many of the impacts on animals are not actually climate change. They're things like factory farming. They're things like the fact that we take all of their resources. They say, no, farming is better for animals. First, this is unresponsive to a large number of the mechs that Ben gives you, which explains that we are just doing things like deforesting their habitats, taking their sets of resources. But also, it is not. I would say that animals yearn for freedom. Animals yearn to be able to do what they want and not to go through the horrific things that factory farming do. Things like sterilization are obviously terrible. Obviously, we are the side that claims the most utility experiencing creatures. Final thing we tell you is that humanity will end anyway, things like war and disease. And note how close we've been to ending. And you can't just say we haven't ended yet, but like, obviously we've been incredibly close. And at the point where we do, that completely removes opposition bench's benefit because it means we're going to die anyway. We just explain that it is better because first, there is less suffering. And second, we don't take the rest of the planet with us. Look, obviously this motion is counterintuitive, but that doesn't mean this isn't a prediction game of what a person would do. The average reasonable voter is willing to be convinced. We convince them that this will be bad. Vote opening government.
And the Deputy Prime Minister for their fine speech. I'm super happy to welcome the Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
Hello, can I be heard?
You can be heard.
All right. I'm going to start the speech in 3, 2, 1. First question, what is the moral underpinning of the opening government case? The first thing I want to note is they had to explain why the average person was likely to subscribe to the moral constructions they provide on opening government, not that a third-party benevolent actor was likely to do so. I think that David has proven things that are more likely to be close to the things that an average person would believe for a few reasons. Firstly, the same evolutionary beliefs that you have to want to be able to survive are likely to be the same ones that influence this person's particular moral framework, i.e. they have a belief that humanity should persist, i.e. they have a belief that there is a value to human life, etc. And therefore, it is far more likely to subscribe to the things David mentions. Not only that, but we have all grown up in a society that has emphasized your willingness to think that there's value in your family, your parents being alive, or that there is some glory to human achievement that can be achieved in the future that you are preemptively preventing from ever occurring. In this instance, where the motion takes you makes you particularly take on the role of an average person, not one that is likely to care significantly about animal rights, etc., it is unclear why the constructions on government are the ones that are more likely to persist for this particular person. But let's debate OG and why is it that they're still morally incorrect. They explain that they are far more likely to fulfill the utilitarian metric, but never justify this utilitarian metric. There are 3 problems with what they provide. The first is that it is unclear why utilitarianism is precisely measured by the physical harm to the body, i.e. look at their harms, starvation, hunger, a potential harm from other human beings. What I'd note is that there are people who live in poverty and do suffer physically, but are still willing to determine their lives to be worthwhile, still determine their lives to be incredibly meaningful. And it is unclear to me, therefore, why the construction of whether or not humans are more likely to enjoy life, feel a utilitarian value to their life, is solely because of the kinds of environments and physical pains that they go through, rather than some kind of perception of the self that we think is far more likely to be important. That's the second thing. Obviously, we can't say that everyone likes their lives or think that they're meaningful. But that's the important thing here. You as an individual person have absolutely no right to play God and say that nobody's lives are worth anything and therefore they should prevent them. I think the ability for a human being to determine and trudge on through life and exercise that degree of agency is far more important than preemptively determining everyone is not living a life that is worthwhile. Because just because there's the physical suffering of the body does not imply that there is a lack of meaning to that life or a lack of value to that life to begin with. Because people can still enjoy lives that they think are, for example, physically painful as a consequence. The only response to this is you cannot meaningfully enjoy your agency. The first question here is, the reason for that is you have evolutionary procedures that make you not want to have any agency of your life. One, obviously humans have evolved to the point of rational thought where they can conceive of themselves and the value of their lives independent of just thinking that evolutionary behaviors are the only thing that are able to determine that for them. But secondly, is that there are active incentives for people to create identities that, no matter how arbitrary, provide a significant amount of meaning to their lives, independent of what your like material reality might be. Which is why we have things like religion, which is why people so closely relate to things like sporting or have hobbies that they enjoy, or things like their family and own local communities that, while might not improve their material realities, often give them a sense of comfort that they want to be able to subscribe to. And that's the last thing. Because they say the world is so filled with this negative utility, but never weigh, why does that outweigh all the positive utility that does exist in this world? What I want to make clear here is that the determination of how positive utility and negative utility are able to outweigh each other, again, cannot be made by an individual in this motion that therefore should play God and say that none of your lives are worth living anyway. As a consequence, the moral underpinning of this case is one, unproven because it's purely tautological to believe we fulfill utilitarianism, utilitarianism is good, without explaining truly what that would be the case. Next, they say that we should encroach on your agency if it harms other forms of life. The first thing I want to note here is they never engage with the comparative. Human beings have forced all the factory farmed animals that they explain to have adapted and build biological features that adapt to the need for human beings. So for example, sheep used to be able to fully survive on their own, but in status quo, because humans have shaved them historically, they build too much wool and will fall over and die and choke without any kind of human that is going to look after them. So this motion does not say we will remove humans from the beginning. It is we will remove humans at the point in history where we have built biology to be incredibly dependent on human care. But secondly is, what David points out is the comparative of, there are so many other species that are willing to kill you, willing to eat you, willing to go after you. And you have to weigh, therefore, who is more likely to care about some kind of inherent life? Who is more likely to at least put in regulations and laws that want to be able to push for you to be killed humanely? Humans or other species, other actors that are unlikely to make this kind of rational calculus because they have not reached that evolutionary stage and therefore will probably just eat you. Like, I don't know what the comparative ability for other animals to get this agency is if other animals are going to eat them as well. Secondly, they say at PM that we are a point of no return for climate change. And what that implies is that the deadly impacts of climate change are still incredibly likely to accrue coming from opening government. The danger here, therefore, is that we don't know how animals are going to adapt to this. However, anthropogenic problems oftentimes require incredibly innovative anthropogenic solutions that only humans are able to come through. And therefore, all the harms of climate change to these animals, if we are at a point of no return, obviously cannot be reversed by them. CG.
Intuitions are instrumental to moral judgments. Utilitarianism is also justified on an intuition of joy. Why should we prioritize your intuitions above ours as an axiom of decision making?
No, again, this is not about moral truth. It is about what is the particular moral truth to this individual. But moreover, I've just explained why the ability to have agency is a far more important moral priority here. So again, climate change not likely to improve and therefore without human beings. And we've already made important strides in being able to do this for all the same evolutionary needs and wants for us to be able to survive years and years into the future. But lastly, guys, if we all disappear, there are so many things we have not accounted for that can cause catastrophic damage to other lives as well. All the nuclear reactors that we have absolutely no one manning anymore. All the oil refineries that are likely to overspill and flow into other kinds of biodiverse areas. All these things without human intervention to prevent these kinds of harms. And so far as everyone just disappears in a snap, makes it incredibly likely that the environmental damage of all the things we leave behind, all the fires that'll be caused, all the things we should have turned off before all disappearing, are going to cause massive environmental damage. For these reasons, I think one, OG is incredibly uncomparative, but two, are unable to defend their own moral framework. I'm very, very proud to propose.
The deputy leader of the opposition for their final speech and everyone on the front half for a good debate so far. To open the back half, I'm super happy to call on the member of government.
Sorry, let me just move the... Am I audible?
You are audible, yeah.
Cool. I'll be starting my speech in 3, 2, one. I tend to do two things. First of all, I'm going to explain why human existence is disutile on net, regardless of whether we solve things like climate change or capitalist oppression, far more structural than opening government. Secondly, I will actually justify our choice of moral metric and respond to opening opposition's actor push. Let's get into it. Rebuttal is interwoven. Why is human existence inherently disutile? First of all, the mechanism of the hedonic treadmill. Look at pleasurable things cause a desire for further such experiences. On intuition, when I started debating, I thought that breaking ESL at UDC would be the happiest moment of my life. It wasn't, because when I did, I wanted a semifinal, I wanted a final, I wanted to go through the end. The problem is this cannot be rationalized away because it's biological. It works on mechanisms of dopamine and serotonin. It's literally how addiction works. Once you get a stimulus, your brain desires that stimulus, but you do not have conscious control over what your brain desires biologically, which is to say that you cannot control this, and it's initially very impossible to be happy on net. The comparative is, however, you cannot acclimatize negatively. If I live without food, I will not get used to hunger. If I live without water, I will not get used to thirst, and we do not get used to our unhappiness and our sadness, which is to say we tend towards unhappiness regardless of the context of which we exist and regardless of evolution. But secondly, even if our experiences are positive on net, human cognition prioritizes negative experiences in building heuristics because they're a defense mechanism. If my romantic partner had cheated on me, then in my next relationship, I'm going to see cheating patterns, even if they're not there. I'm going to behave in a controlling manner, potentially ruin my relationship because I'm wired to do that insofar as I want to protect myself against future analogous experiences. On the comparative, focusing on positive experiences makes us more relaxed and makes us more in harm's way, which is to say that we emphasize negativity, we do not emphasize positivity, regardless of context. That's the explanation of how evolution works. Opening argument just says it's evolutionarily conditioned. That's not an explanation. Thirdly, consciousness is pain regardless of context because humans exist in numerous incomprehensible intertwined systems that they cannot predict and they cannot understand. The weather, which we can only predict 2 days in advance. The idea of creation, how were we created and what are the moral implications of that? Geography and natural disasters, human behavior itself. We seek reason, but we never find it. Unpredictability screws over our lives again and again. I've experienced 2 earthquakes in a pandemic. I can tell you very well about it, which is why we live lives of fear. We are happiest for the 2 weeks when we go to the seaside and we long for predictability. We hope nothing unpredictable happens. And then we say to ourselves, we are happy with this 14 days, made the year worth it. That's not what we experience for the other 340 and something days. But lastly, death itself, at the point where you are dying, at the point where you know that you will die, you are old and or you are sick, this consumes all else because you fear the idea of pain. You fear the void as per all of the mechanisms opening opposition gives you. You fear the idea of nothingness and leaving all of your loved ones behind, as opening opposition describes. What does this mean? This means that a universal experience all humans go through at the end of their lives consumes all of their positive experiences. The utility is only experienced in the present. The last present we experience is death. That present is disutile. We remove that at the point where people's existence is erased, regardless of them being aware of it, because it just happens, which is to say that is the largest disutility that all humans have to face, which we remove. This answers Miko's question of why negativity necessarily has to outweigh positivity, because it's structural to all humans, far beyond opening government. But don't worry, opposition bench. I do intend to justify our choice of metric in this debate because CO does pose a legitimate POI. Why do we stand behind utilitarianism? The first reason why we stand behind it is because it's impossible to ascertain the inherent value of people's preferences, i.e. to claim that one is more objectively valuable than the other. Even if that truth existed in a vacuum, our faculties are not sufficient to access that truth insofar as our attempt to determine metrics of the search would be infected by our own subjective consciousness, experience, and desires, which means that as epistemic actors, the only thing we can defer to is something universal and experiential that all actors go through, i.e. the maximization of total happiness and the minimization of total unhappiness. The comparative and the alternative is the ontology, but the ontology necessarily begs the question, which is to say the ontology is based on the premise that some things are inherently wrong. The question is, why are they wrong? Lying is wrong. Is it? Sometimes it feels bad, but it might be a good thing. Sometimes they're culturally imposed, like the idea that we revolt ourselves towards homosexuality because that's what religion tells us. Opening opposition asks you to arbitrarily prioritize intuition over intuition. The intuition of revulsion or of the desire to exist above the intuition of suffering, they do not give a justification for that. The comparative is all humans experience utility. We can use tools like arithmetics to determine utility. It's something that we all go through and therefore is a more reason-based mechanism. But the second justification is that if this is an actor motion, when we encounter the button, we assume the role of proxy. We begin to act as a representative of the individuals for whom we make the decision. At the point where we cannot confer with them, we need to defer to the best possible approximation of what we think is utile as opposed to disutile. Given the arguments I've given you before, it's likely, and given that also people themselves experience a lot of this utility, it is likely that it's more persuasive to conclude, and it's also statistically true because most people are statistically born into poverty, and you learn to see this in 6th grade geography. It it is more likely that you're going to remove disutility more than you would remove utility. The same goes for politicians when they approximate people's preferences when they do policy. The same goes for parents when they approximate children's preferences, which is to say, insofar as you act as proxy, you have a duty to go for utilitarianism insofar as no other moral metric is accessible to you. We justify the moral metric as opposed to opening government. But opening opposition says, actor motion. I have 4 responses to this. First of all, as per the world's manual, actors still have moral obligations regardless of their perspectives. Secondly, insofar as we can prove the benefits of the actor in 15 minutes, we've come up with them and proven them in 7. Dylan has 7 more. We can persuade the actor this is good for them. But thirdly, not that intuitions are only shortcuts. Intuitions are something we do on a whim, but this is an incredibly hard moral decision. You act on the behalf of the entirety of humanity. People are more likely to consider higher order reasoning and to take time to go over the decision. That's why people sacrifice themselves for values, even though it's inherently irrational to be dead. That's why people are willing, generals in war are willing to allow civilians to be bombed for more people to survive. Haha, conveniently, utilitarianism. Before I give my 4th response, I'll engage with opening opposition.
The whole problem with utilitarianism is that it is impossible to assume what people think is utile for them, and our whole point is that utility is built on preference, hence you cannot defer to some value that you decide for other people.
If it's impossible to assume, then your case becomes a non-starter to the same extent to which you claim the government cases, because you cannot assume that your decision is the correct one either, which means to break this deadlock, you need to find a common ground which to defer to, which are arguments and conditions which apply to humanity universally, regardless of context, and therefore abstracted from subjectivity. The 4 reasons I gave at the top of my speech, you can't win this debate. The 4th justification is, as I said, utilitarianism tends to be more intuitive than all the other reasons. I've explained that before. Last is short response on animals, because opening government doesn't do it, so I'll defend their case so I can win. Animals that are bred for food will die anyway because we kill them. There are tens of thousands of species that are not bred for food. We've seen these species revitalized during the COVID pandemic. It is factual that they thrive. I don't know how opening opposition can claim differently, but also OG doesn't give the justification for this. Why killing humans instead of anything else? The reparatory principle. We must give what was taken away. We've taken away not just their habitat. We kill them. We take away their lives. Insofar as we take away complete integrity must be given back. The body must be given for the body. That's the justification for the opening government principle. I've never been prouder to stand on the government bench.
And the member got up for their fine speech, and I'm super happy to welcome the member of opposition.
Great. Can I confirm I'm clearly audible?
You are clearly audible.
Great. Starting in 3, 2, 1. I'm going to win on deontology, and then I'm going to win on utility, but first I'm going to explain why we way over opening this debate for 3 reasons. First, their case is contingent on a series of assertions about the mental state of the person we do not have epistemic access to. That person may be depressed. That person might have the worldview of opening and closing government, or hold a similar worldview analogous to that. That person might be a utility monster, and even though you probably can't calculate the absolute utility of erasing humanity in terms of the utilitarian metrics given on GovBench, I imagine they might think they can. There are many reasons to believe that a person might want to push the button. We genuinely don't know, even if they prove that probabilistically they might be more likely to. Second, even if you feel guilty, as opening government observes, this harm is incredibly short term. We're going to outweigh on scale and explain why guilt is short term, but the harm you inflict on every human that ever could exist in the future is larger. Third, their practical case is contingent on humankind being able to cope with the current problems we're facing, like climate change and so on. We're not sure. Maybe opening government is right. Maybe it will nuke everyone. They might not. Our case won't be contingent on either. We'll explain why the moral harm you incur as an individual is massive, and you ought not do that. Firstly, on the deontology, why is this profoundly principally unjust? Tin already did the actor motion weighing thing, but given that this is an actor debate from the perspective of the average intelligence voter, that doesn't mean that you as an individual don't have obligations to the other people around you. That is your state, your family, your friends, your human community, and so on and so forth. You likely care about this, but even more than that, insofar as you are an individual who can reason those things, we can persuade you that you ought care about this. First, Dylan and a POI to OO say it is unclear which moral framework is epistemically correct. This is true, but you probably don't have time in the moment also to do cost-benefit analysis on whether or not you actually aggregate out utility. Insofar as you cannot accurately assess this in the moment, I claim you have a moral obligation to defer to leaving humanity alive. Why? Firstly, most people have a revealed preference for being alive, and you know most people have a revealed preference for to be alive. This is why most people continue to exist. Opening government says, it's just biological. So I have no idea why that matters. Insofar as that's their preference, you should not violate it. Secondly, there is no opt-out ability from non-existence, but there is an opt-out ability from existence. There are things like voluntary euthanasia that are becoming more normalized in society and socially acceptable. For people who want to rationally opt out, there are still mechanisms by which you can do so. The comparative is there is no opt-out ability from non-existence because you never exist in the first place. You are a blank slate. There is nothing in the world that you ever exist, and you have no ability to choose. Finally, there are coping mechanisms that exist for the harms of existence. These coping mechanisms are huge. Therapy, family, friends, consoling people. All of these things are people can access. I think in terms of minimizing harm and importantly, minimizing the harm in the moment, we win. But secondly, in order to push the button, you have to believe you are doing humanity and the world a favor. Even if this is the morally optimal choice by some metric, which we cannot calculate, I think it is always wrong to use everyone else's life as a means to an end in order to attain social progress. Gov might say, we instrumentalize people all the time. They have to pay taxes and so on to the state. I think that firstly, this is less in scale, not the absolute horror of being used as a means to an end by your very existence and being extinguished in order to achieve some social progress. Secondly, even if it is the same scale, taxes or even like military service are not every facet of your identity. That is, it's fine for me to instrumentalize Ahmed by ordering pizza for him, but even if we don't know he doesn't want it, but it's wrong for me to take moral agents and solely treat them as a means to an end. This is why you can't take the organs out of someone in a hospital and kill him to save the lives of 5 others. In the same way, it's not just to kill all humans to save 5,000 animals. Not only do our moral intuitions align with this, I think that insofar as their claim is this is morally utile in some way because we win on utility, this principle supersedes utility because we provide an alternate metric to explain why utilitarianism in this instance is wrong. But thirdly, you are likely to believe that this is an active moral good to bring life into the world. This is because most of us value children, consider these things, and our conception of the rights to the state claim that you have moral obligations to future generations, i.e. this is where our philosophical ideas and intuitions about paying into things like welfare systems over the years, or raising children, or paying for public schools so the next generation can be educated, or fighting climate change, because we believe that children are important. I think not only do you believe this to be true, but you fail in obligation that you have to bring life into the world to continue that perpetuation. And insofar as you cannot accurately access the preferences of every individual who would exist on our side if you don't press this button, that is however many millions of people that would come into the world, you have to, per my first analysis, defer to the fact that they would have chosen, because for the people who would not, there are opt-out mechanisms, there are coping mechanisms, but there's no opt-out, no coping mechanism, and no ability not to choose on their side of the house. Second claim, why do we win on utility? What is the unique moral value of human experience? I think, firstly, utilitarianism is probably unclear if you can access ultimate utilitarianism on GovBench of human erasure on non-human actors. Some species will go extinct and die, some species won't. I'm not sure who's right there. Figure that out in a discussion. But opening opposition say that it's an attack on agency, but don't explain why it's morally important. The reason it's wrong is to amplify every harm on OG. In order to weigh any argument in OG in this debate, you have to believe restrictions on agency are bad. This is the reason we consider, and they consider, capitalism on the crusades to be bad, because they rob people of the ability to access agency and their conception of the good life. So on their own principled framework, we flip this because all of their reasons for why humanity is on net disutile flip at the point at which you erase all chance at human experience ever rectifying those inequities. So they create a greater moral inequity in the attempt to solve lesser order moral inequities. But second, I think there's something uniquely valuable at human existence that you cannot weigh off even against other animals. Note that every conception of the good life we have as human beings is predicated first on existence. That is, for me to experience any positive emotion, I must first exist. My ability to fall in love, to walk down the road and smell flowers, to stare at gorgeous sunsets or a new snowfall is contingent on me being able to think and appreciate those things. I must first be existent in order to think those thoughts or exercise that capacity. This means that any positive utility I can experience and any moral framework I can ever evaluate is contingent first on my ability to exist. Note that these positive experiences are unique and distinct from animals insofar as, firstly, to the best of our knowledge, the level of sentience that human beings possess is unique. It is unclear whether other animals possess the same degree of reflexivity in their intelligence to experience and appreciate beauty and experience the same way. And even if they do, we don't know if they have the capacity to experience and express it the same way. So it can never truly be verified. The comparative is the harm of killing all humans can be verified. We know that they express the higher order capacity of thoughts because they have documented proof of that ability to express those thoughts. So killing those individuals is harmful because you erase a unique moral agent from the world. Secondly, each positive human experience is unique because each human being is a unique moral value with infinite dignity, emotion, and an inner world that is unique, valuable, and distinct from every other human being. The intuition is why we consider individual human rights to be important and every individual equally valuable. We don't know if any animal or any other being that could exist or will exist has an internal world of this scale and magnitude. So when you erase all humanity, you are erasing a key facet of experience that might never exist in the world elsewhere. Before I explain the final implication of this, open and go.
The problem with this agency argument is that you need to prove people actually consent on your side. We explain that people are born with an arbitrary aversion to death and therefore are, without their consent, exposed to all these staggering harms that we do.
But the difference is, as I have explained ad nauseum in my speech, you possess opt-out, coping, and other forms of ways in which you can weigh off that trade-off. At the point at which you don't exist, you violate the consent of all the people who would choose to be alive. The final thing I want to note here is that these unique experiences of every individual human aggregates together to create communities, cultures, and traditions. These have value, which is the intuition by which you consider cultural preservation to be good and colonialism to be bad, which OG concedes they think is important when they talk about the Crusades. You end all of those things prior to them, and you end the agglomeration of moral value in human exchange. These are forms of moral expression you cannot weigh because each culture is individually valuable, and you don't have epistemic access to determine which is more or less value. But also, reparatory principle that Tim talks about. You take away that reparatory principle. Insofar as there's any progress toward reparations for Black people for slavery, you short circuit that at the point at which the net moral harm that has been done to Black people is empirically greater than the rectification that has happened. So you short circuit any chance of the moral arc of history bending for justice. When you argue for voluntary extinction, finally, this is an infinite utility harm. Why? Because it's not just that you don't come into existence, it's that every potential human culture or every interaction that any human culture could ever have between different experiences is erased forever. These are unique benefits that we know about. We do not know what the benefits or harms to animals will ultimately be in that comparison. These are unique experiences that you erase forever. Incredibly proud to win from closing up.
I thought the memorable position for their fine speech. It's now time for the whip speeches, starting with Dominant Whip.
Audible.
You are audible.
Fabulous. Not to be born is best, far best that can befall. Next best when born, without delay, is to trace the backward way. What is the moral framework by which we should evaluate this debate? Opening opposition say it's the actor's perspective. I think firstly, this is a gray area vis-a-vis the rules of British parliamentary debating, but I don't care about those rules too much, so I'm going to engage in this clash anyways. The more important thing, though, is that an actor motion is not a predictive evaluation of what an actor will do. Otherwise, debating would be completely pointless. It is given a set of certain values. How can we A, shape those values, or B, best fulfill those values? We say a given person with no set preferences, no set cultural background, and no set a priori position approaching this debate can be persuaded by claims within the context of this debate because that's the premise of debating within the first place. Noting here, there are values that they have are intuitions in the first place. These intuitions are universally applied across people, but they are nonetheless intuitions. We propose to you in closing opposition that not only are intuitions things like the revulsion from opening opposition, I'm using revulsion as a byword for the conglomerate that they outlined there because they all resolve back to that person-first perspective versus utilitarianism, the universal perspective that we propose to you in closing government. What best persuades them is the next question. We propose to you that it's utilitarianism. There's responses to opening opposition, but also like whipping Kin's analysis. The first to say is that the intuitions that they talk about in opening opposition are culturally defined. So you can point to, for example, the fact that some people find homosexuality to be revulsive and some indeed don't. Secondly, you can find that it has mistaken triggers because obviously the way in which intuitions present themselves are a proxy by which we can make moral judgments in the time where we don't have to consider the decision itself, which is to say that oftentimes we believe something is wrong and yet do it anyways, which is to say oftentimes telling a lie feels revulsive, but we do it anyway for the consequences that would happen as a result of making that lie, the honest lie and the noble lie. The third thing to say is that there's an arithmetic perspective here, which is to say, if you take these subjective evaluations and the different intuitions that individuals might have, there's no way to weigh up those intuitions if they're fundamentally subjective evaluations. It's just what feels strongest to the actor in the individual moment. We provide to you the idea that because not only is utilitarianism based off of an intuition of joy being good and suffering being bad, that everyone universally can tap into, but it can also be used arithmetically to make evaluations thereafter, which is to say, because it is intersubjective and therefore approximates objectivity, you can do things like weighing up the net total utility that exists within humanity. You can't weigh up revulsions and preferences in the same kind of way. We propose to you that you use these kind of intuitions as a shorthand for moral value, but in instances where an individual has a large life decision to make, or indeed the largest decision that any human has ever made throughout the course of human history, they will take time to consider it beyond just what their intuitions on face tell them. They will consider the question more deeply using the tools and history of philosophers that they have considered within the context of their life to make those kinds of decisions. As a consequence, then, they are willing to be open to the arguments that we present before the House. CO says this, aha, deontology. But the problem with this is, of course, deontology fundamentally begs the question. The idea of, they say, reciprocity is a good thing, but why is reciprocity a fundamentally good thing? Well, you should bring it back to the natural state. Why should you do that, etc.? The reason why utilitarianism is a fundamentally valuable moral framework here is because it A, takes on the intuition, which means that you're not just creating an assertive moral framework, but B, can be evaluative in that kind of sense as well, using arithmetic evaluations, which means that it is the kind of decision that someone ought to and indeed would defer to in instances that are irrelevant in the context of this debate, which is why we unlock the actor analysis and also mechanize the claims on this perspective. I would also like to note in response to closing opposition, when they say that there's no opt-out of non-existence, that's obviously untrue insofar as that individual that could have been born does not exist. It's called the non-identity problem in philosophy. I'm sure Ahmed has read about it because I sent him a paper about it before. I'm sure his responses will be decent here. But the problem here, therefore, is because there is no moral value that can accrue to a non-existent actor by definition of them not existing, you can't consider the fact that they cannot opt out to be a moral harm, and therefore CO's case on this is unpersuasive. When they say that an individual is a means to an end, I think firstly, CF, my previous analysis, the reason why you might believe someone to be a means to an end is based off of intuition, which we've already weighed against. And indeed, in a lot of instances, we think it's reasonable for someone to be a means to an end. For example, for social change, I do think it's fine to weaponize people for social change. But also, we would contend to you that, like everyone's existence right now is also a means to an end for the productivity of capital. Less general analysis. Animals that exist within the context of the world right now exist fundamentally towards the means for an end for individuals, but I'll engage with that later. Therefore, we would propose to you that that is the best moral framework. The other evaluation on this is just to say that when closing opposition say that every individual has a unique perspective, that is not a moral claim, but just an evaluative claim, and therefore it means that you cannot weigh against them, mechanizing a subjectivity claim. But also when they say that people have intuitions against death, I would note that in a lot of instances people agree with euthanasia when instances of someone's life being inherently or like visibly a utility negative, we think it's fine for them to choose death. When we can prove to you that utility is negative, we are able to mechanize that evaluation in the individual's mindset and therefore win from closing government. On which side do we get more suffering? Opening government say two things. If evolution, I think firstly give no analysis with regards to evolution as to why we can't adapt to beat that evolution. We weren't evolved to debate on laptops, and yet here we are. Tin uniquely provides this analysis by explaining why cognition is a fundamentally torturous activity because we are always seeking for rationality and cannot find it. We are always pondering the question of death and cannot answer it. But secondly, when he explains to you the hedonic treadmill analysis, which explains to you that even in a context that's radically outside of our evolution, we're still constrained by our evolution, filling in that gap from opening government. Secondly, with regards to capitalism, it's just not true in all instances, but it's also general analysis. They never explain to us why the technique which we should use to engage with capitalism is the end of the world in and of itself, as opposed to just engaging generally in social activism to try and ameliorate that overall. We prove more fundamental and universal things in this basis. Opening opposition say two things. They say, aha, agency, and CO repeat this. I would note that we only care about agency insofar as it exists within the human condition, which is we believe that as a human actor, it is immoral to infringe upon an individual's agency. It's why we think that there's no moral obligation to have as many kids as you possibly can. It's why we think that disability is not immoral, but restricting disabled individuals from getting accessibility is an immoral thing because you're restricting their agency with regards to the state in which they are. Before I move on, opening.
Yes, actors can consider moral obligations, but these are moral frameworks that they've constructed for themselves and not ones we've made up to this debate. Our point is that despite that, no argument could convince most people out of killing their children and their best friends and everyone they've ever loved.
If British parliamentary debating has evolved to the point where we have to assume the same level of ignorance as an actor, I don't want to get through this semi-final, but I think our case has already dealt with it. In terms of accommodation, as closing opposition repeat from opening opposition, I would like to note that our analysis here works because these claims only target opening government. We're able to explain to you that there are just certain descriptive conditions that means that an individual experiences pain, and therefore the accommodation for that pain and the adaptation to that pain that opposition meant to outline targets them. It does not target us who outline fundamental considerations, which means that an individual cannot evade the pain of existence in the first place. Final question is on external effects. Obviously, if it's an actor motion, who cares? Secondly, if it's utilitarianism, we would say that we create a great reset, because even if opening opposition are right, that nuclear war erased the entirety of animality, they're able to adapt to it going forward to the future and create a natural habitat in which they can thrive, far away from the human conditions we impose upon them, which they have no evolutionary capacity to understand. It just leads to fear and suffering. If it's the ontology, the reciprocity argument lands. Envy, sedition, strife, carnage, and our utmost desires tell the tale of life. We would urge you to propose this motion because we believe that humanity has failed.
We got the whip for their fine speech, and to conclude this semi-final, I'm happy to call on the opposition whip.
Hey everyone, am I audible?
Yep, you're audible, but you could come closer to your microphone, but it's still.
Is this better?
Yeah, it'll do. I'm sure it's fine.
Great. If I become inaudible, please let me know. For POIs, put them in the chat. Don't verbally interrupt. With that being said, Matt, can you start the timer? Great. Three, two, one. No matter how beautiful and well-crafted a coffin might look, it will never make anyone wish for death. I'm going to weigh against OO and then do a little bit on CG and then kind of wash out the top half a bit more. On OO, in actor motions, we act as angels on the shoulders of the actor. We do not literally take up the mind of the actor because that's what makes it a debate, convincing them what they ought to. Why does that matter? They need to explain why the actor should care about those individual biases, not that they simply have these biases. Why does Matt win? Their analysis at best says you should do this because some moral will make you feel guilty if you don't. Matt says that the fact that you had to take any action for someone else to avoid guilt is instrumentalizing them, and that you as an actor has obligations and should care about those obligations. Matt explains why it's you likely believe in these obligations because of a duty to future generations, a duty to not instrumentalize people in a truly terrible way for societal benefit. Matt's second extension is also far more comparative to Gov, because he doesn't rely on a conception of morals via tautologies like this is like murder and murder is wrong. Matt adds particular nuance that utility outside the effects of humanity on this motion is very speculative. It is possible that you will be able to save some animals on Gov, and some animals might die on Op. The problem is they just assume that every moral agent has precisely the same utility. Matt explains what is unique about human beings existing and being able to exist that provision them with unique value. Matt explains the unique things that set human beings apart, i.e. reflexivity in thought, the uniqueness of human beings as a social animal, the uniqueness of each human's interior world. Matt explains when taken together, these phenomena constitute a unique moral obligation that has moral value, and therefore why you as an actor likely care about it. Matt explains why no matter if you believe GovBench wins on utility, which is inherently speculative, it is morally wrong to use people as a means to an end in totality. Now I'm going to take on CG. Note, I think if I rebut CG, it's also rebutting OG, insofar as OG rely on a justification for why utility ought to be the metric and why humanity is structurally suffering. So if I rebut the best case of OG, which is CG, I also beat OG in the process. On CG, they give 4 mechanisms for why human existence is structurally suffering. Firstly, the hedonic treadmill. I would note that 1, humans have developed large coping mechanisms to deal with it, i.e. narratives that say try your best and it's fine if you fail, or having a friend that tells you it's okay. Secondly, they presume humans have no capacity for managing those expectations on the human treadmill. That is to say, I know that Matt will never love me, but I manage my expectation to just be his friend because it will make me happier. Thirdly, there are large distractions that provide breaks in meaning and allow you to escape and take a break from running on the treadmill. But fourthly, the hedonic treadmill harms, note, are uniquely tied to things that are cleanly measurable, i.e. debate comps as the example used in MG, but it doesn't apply to the large range of human experiences where you cannot really compare them between each other. That is to say, your ability to find solace in being a good father or a friend, or the moment you fall in love and the butterflies you feel in your stomach in that moment. It's unclear why the hedonic treadmill operates at every point in life like they say. Secondarily, they say you emphasize more negative experiences because of via heuristics. I would again say that there have been coping mechanisms to deal with this, like therapy for it or narratives that tell you to look on the bright side, but I would actually flip it. I think humans actually focus on the positive more. Why? 1, I'll use OG's evolutionary mech and steal it and say it's because they want to avoid depression and being suicidal, so they focus on the bright side. But 2, humans want to feel valuable and better about themselves and the life they've lived. But thirdly, humans interact with other human beings that don't like bad vibes, so they're likely to reinforce more positive experiences and make them laugh. Thirdly, they say you cannot predict the world, which leads to suffering. I think there's actually finding beauty in the unpredictability, i.e. what will I do tomorrow? Who will I meet? It makes every moment special because you don't know what's going to happen to it. At worst, if you don't buy that, there are enough annoying, sunny, and bright people that I just mentioned like this that make this mechanism unlikely to be wholly representative and structural, as CG say. Fourthly, they say at the point of death, it consumes all positive utility. So at that present point, it is therefore makes the rest of your life feel like shit because at that point, you're so scared. 1, they assert that it is a negative experience because things are about to end. Here's why it's likely positive. 1, you look at a life well lived with family by your deathbed because people around you want to make you feel like as if your life mattered. Or secondarily, there's lots of excitement about what's next. Who will I see the rest of my family in the afterlife? Where will I go to? Will I be reincarnated? Or thirdly, I think, and this addresses the more structural part, people naturally develop coping mechanisms to look at death positively, i.e. narratives that glorify the elderly. The upshot of all of this, they give reasons for why there are moments of people to be sad and why they can be sad, but not why it is certain that the aggregate negative is in fact more than the aggregate positive. Let's say you don't buy that. Why should the metric not be utility, which also takes out the premise OG relies on? They say utility is the only metric all humans are universally capable of, the intuition everybody shares. 1, this principle is again contingent on the proving that there is more suffering, or a probability and a clear probability there's more suffering to take this action, which I made unclear. But secondarily, it's entirely contingent on being able to measure and quantify people's utility and suffering. You literally cannot accurately measure people's utility on the grand scale that this motion requires, which is unique to other scenarios, because 1, you literally do not have access to their actual minds and how they value the rest of their life and their self-actualization. Secondarily, it's dynamic. People's utility changes from time to time. Thirdly, it's weighed differently between different people. And fourthly, people cannot communicate particular emotions at all points because they may lack the language. The upshot is that the criteria they use and OG rely on is one that they cannot even win on because they can't measure or quantify or even weigh it between people and say whether it's more or less. But if it is util, Matt also wins on that if you can measure utility, because Matt explained why humans get more utility out of existence than insects. Insofar as you cannot assess the scale of animal suffering on either side, you can measure utility human beings derive from cultures, life, etc. So on all metrics, we beat CG and therefore OG, but I'll give them a chance right now. PY, OG? OG, do you
In
have
a
a
messy
PY?
abstract debate where people drone on about nerdy philosophy shit, OG provides the clearest and most concrete harm, which is people suffering under war, genocide, capitalist oppression, and an evolutionary coded badness. Clearest harm in the debate.
Yeah. This is perfect. The reason why you're going to lose is because nerds read philosophy and you probably should read philosophy. But let's now take out their case. The top half clash in whether society is becoming better or worse, which leads to the kind of human suffering that OO rely on partially, but OG rely on a lot. It's impossible for you to make the adjudication on this. Why? Because one, it relies on major structural forces that exist in society that we don't have every particular information about. Secondarily, things that we structurally cannot have information about, i.e. one, the incentives of other powerful actors and how they will change the world, i.e. the CIA and the info they have or what Jeff Bezos' next plans are, or B, people's preferences on the ground. You cannot fully predict how they'll react to, for example, like decreasing resources. But thirdly, the interaction effects of all these things. Maybe some info about scarce resource, maybe like there's like people will be scared about scarce resources, but how does this interact with the developments in technology? Will technology be widely available or restricted? You cannot know how these major structural forces, even if you know some of them, interact with the ones that you do not know and whether you'll solve climate change. The upshot of all of this is that analysis that explains whether humanity will improve or not in animals is incredibly uncertain and speculative. Not to say it doesn't matter on their own. I don't want to be one of those teams that says top half washes out, but that analysis is contingent on it. Analysis that is contingent on it has to matter less because there's so many assumptions you have to make in order to buy those impacts. Never been prouder to oppose. I'd say we won from OpWhip, but Matt won from MO.
On the opposition whip for their final speech, and everyone thought was genuinely a very good debate. Congratulate each other and yourselves. We will now adjudicate. Everyone, please leave. It's your best incentive to do so we can finish quickly.